This video was brought to you by Brilliant. Since coming to power, Starmer has pursued a conspicuously cautious Brexit policy. Having previously campaigned for Remain and then a second referendum, since becoming Labour leader in 2020, Starmer has ruled out basically any significant changes to the current Brexit agreement. He's ruled out a customs union, the single market, freedom of movement, and a couple of weeks ago said that the UK wouldn't rejoin the EU in his lifetime. However, as the political risks of what we might call de-Brexitization have waned, we've seen signs that Labour might actually be open to a closer relationship with the EU than has previously been suggested, especially via their proposed UK-EU security agreement. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Labour's plan for Brexit, this new security deal, and how things might change in the future. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, let's get straight into it. Broadly speaking, Starmer and Labour want to do three things to improve UK-EU relations. The first is a change in tone. Labour just want to be friendlier and easier to negotiate with than their Conservative predecessors, especially Boris Johnson, who, at least in the eyes of the EU, had a habit of reneging on its promises, and Liz Truss, who once famously questioned whether or not Macron's France was a friend or foe of the UK's. This is fundamentally because Starmer sees no political gain in starting fights with the EU, both because Labour's base and parliamentary party are broadly pro-EU, and because Starmer has in many ways pitched himself as sort of the anti-Johnson, someone who will repair the UK's international standing by maintaining good ties with its international allies and by not breaking international law. Now, the second change is a number of relatively minor amendments to the current Brexit deal, technically known as the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA. The TCA provides for reviews of implementation every 5 years, with the first due in 2026. And originally, senior Labour figures were optimistic that these reviews could be used to make some pretty substantial changes, mostly aimed at reducing trade frictions along the EU-UK border. However, while some member states are open to renegotiations, the big players in the EU have since made it clear that they're not all that interested in reopening old Brexit wounds, largely because the EU just has a lot on its plate at the moment, including Ukraine's accession, a trade war with China, and escalating internal disputes between what we might describe as the pro-European establishment and an ever-growing Eurosceptic contingent, mostly from the political right. Understandably, many EU countries therefore don't want to have to spend more time talking about Brexit, and would instead prefer to focus on the plethora of other more pressing issues facing the bloc at the moment. Labour have duly toned down their expectations, and they now only want to make some pretty minimal changes. From what we've read, it seems that there are three changes that Starmer and co want to make. First, they want closer regulatory alignment with the chemicals industry. In an interview with the Financial Times a few days before the election, Chancellor Rachel Reeves talked about a bespoke agreement for the chemicals industry to reduce UK-EU trade frictions and the cost of registering in the UK. Second, Labour's manifesto said that they want to negotiate a veterinary agreement to prevent unnecessary border checks. For context, since Brexit, the EU has treated agri-food exports from Great Britain, like raw meat and dairy products, as if they were coming from a third country. This means that the relevant products now need both physical checks to ensure compliance with EU standards and what's known as an export health certificate, which in turn requires a signature from a vet. On top of this, border checks for medium or high-risk products like live animals were phased in at the end of April 2024. This is pretty standard practice in international trade between third countries, but because the UK and EU used to do a lot of trade in agri-food before Brexit, these new checks have proved pretty disruptive, and Labour hope that by negotiating an agreement that would reduce these checks, they can make things easier for both British and European exporters. Thirdly, Labour also want an agreement on mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or MRPQ. In practice, this basically means that people who are qualified in certain professions in one territory are recognised as such in another. So, for instance, if you're qualified as a professional accountant in the UK, you can do business in the EU as a qualified accountant without having to re-qualify by doing a whole load of different exams in a different country. In theory, this could be great news for the UK economy, given that the UK's main export is professional services, and the EU is its largest proximate market. Services are actually one of the UK's unsung strengths. The UK is the second largest services exporter in the world after the US. But there are a couple of caveats worth mentioning here. Firstly, the UK service exports to the EU have actually held up relatively well so far without a deal, so it's not obvious that this would have a major impact. Secondly, while there are some provisions within the TCA for MRPQs, experience suggests that these usually take time. Canada, for instance, had similar provisions in their trade deal with the EU, but because European professionals didn't want to be undercut by their British or Canadian equivalents, they can often resist MRPQs, which means they take ages. It took Canada 9 rounds of negotiations over more than a year to do a deal specifically for architects. Conscious of the limited nature of these changes, the third improvement that Labour have suggested is supplementing these changes with a new UK-EU security deal. This is something the EU is actually pretty keen on, because the UK is still considered one of the big military players in Europe, and the UK and EU currently have basically zero formal mechanisms for coordinating security and foreign policy. Labour have suggested that this deal could touch on a range of other areas as well. In an article in Foreign Affairs from April, Foreign Secretary David Lammy said that the deal should, quote, drive closer coordination across a wide variety of military, economic, climate, health, cyber, and energy security issues. Now, the scope of any legally binding agreement will be limited by the fact that if it touches on areas like energy or AI regulations, then it would have to abide by single market rules. So Labour might instead prefer a political agreement that could be signed relatively quickly and then built on over time. Such a deal would also give the UK leverage if Labour later decided that they want a better Brexit deal more broadly. In other words, Labour would be able to use the promise of a legally binding security agreement, which is something that many EU countries would be keen on, in exchange for better trading terms. While they're wary of de-Brexiting at the moment, there are two things that might make Labour change their mind here. First, the political calculation could change if the mundanity of 5 years on the backbenches renders arch-Brexiteer Nigel Farage and his Reform Party politically redundant, or if Labour's parliamentary party start pushing for a closer relationship. Secondly, if economic growth and therefore tax revenues remain stagnant, Labour might decide that a closer relationship with the EU is both their best chance at boosting the UK's growth rate and less politically risky than raising taxes or borrowing more money to pay for the necessary repairs to the UK's crumbling public services. Regardless, we'll have to keep an eye as the months go on how Labour's approach and attitude towards Brexit begins to shift. It's interesting that even as people ostensibly into politics, the TLDR team spends more and more time analysing data and economic information as it becomes increasingly critical. But as a bunch of people who are ordinarily more focused on words than numbers, we've really benefited from courses on brilliant.org in order to keep ourselves sharp. That's because Brilliant is the best way to learn maths and computer science in a fun and interactive way. From foundational and advanced maths to AI, data science, neural networks, decision making, and more, with new lessons added monthly. Even if you, like us, don't necessarily think of yourself as a traditionally STEM kind of person, these courses could prove incredibly useful for your life and career. In fact, Brilliant recently launched a ton of new content in data, all of which uses real-world data to train you to see trends and make better informed decisions. When it comes to our work, courses like these can help us to parse and visualize massive datasets and make them easier for both us and you to interpret. Plus, these new courses include real-life datasets from sources like Starbucks, X, and Spotify in order to bring the learning to life. To try everything that Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/TLDR or click the link in the description. Plus, by doing so, you'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you for watching, and thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video.